up? It's the Pro Football Focus Fantasy Podcast. My name is Jeff Ratcliffe, and it's Wednesday, May 6th. It's kind of a quiet day on the football front. Not a whole lot doing news-wise. I'm not going to sit here and talk about DeShone Kizer. Man, at one point, I guess I am going to talk about DeShone Kizer. At one point, this guy looked like he was going to be a decent dynasty prospect. Yeah, that did not pan out. Anyway, I want to take today as an opportunity to give a little bit of insight into my process. And a big part of the process, obviously watching the players is key, but it's also diving through some of the deeper stats, the deeper metrics, the things that don't show up in the box score to get a better sense of who these players are. So I want to expose you to a little of that, some of the key stats that I use at PFF on today's show. I want to start off at wide receiver. So the key in fantasy football, obviously, is, scoring the most points. We know that. How do we score the most points? Well, a big factor is scoring touchdowns, especially long touchdowns, right? Hey, if you have a 5-yard touchdown reception, you're talking 6.5 points. If you have a 25-yard touchdown pass, now we're talking 8.5 points just by tacking on the yards. The longer the touchdown, the more value that play has. Now, long touchdowns are hard to come by. Let's be honest. They're hard to come by in the NFL, especially long catch and run. I'm a big advocate of looking at target location. Where is the receiver on the field when he's targeted? The closer to the end zone, the better. But I'm not going to talk about end zone targets right now. That is one of the stats I talk about all the time. We'll do a ton of that in season. And if you're a long listener of this podcast, you know that we've delved deep into that particular topic. But something I haven't talked that much about. Now, we talk about ADOT, average depth of target, but it's not just about how far downfield you're targeted. It's how frequently downfield you're targeted. So a deep ball at PFF, we define that as any target that's 20 yards in the air or more. So I took a look, and this is something I'll do in the evaluation process. So when I was putting together my rankings, my PPR rankings that went live at PFF.com yesterday, top 200 for free, you can check those out. But when I was going through all of that, I always sort of go back through some of these stats for some insight. Because remember, projections is where I start, but I move players around based on a variety of things. And yes, a lot of those things are subjective, but ranking is a subjective process. Regardless, deep ball targets. Now, last year, the leader in deep ball targets was Kenny Golladay. I don't think that's a big surprise. 37 deep ball targets. He caught 16 of them. He scored 5 touchdowns on those deep ball targets. The value of those 5 touchdowns obviously is significantly more because, hey, the ball traveled at least 20 yards. So you're talking about an 8-point play or greater. In a PPR, a 9-point play or greater. That's pretty darn valuable. And he did it 5 times. So obviously, hey, putting him up in the top 10, initially when I first projected it out, when I first had him in that range, it's sometimes, hey, you do question yourself. And yesterday on the podcast, if you didn't listen to it, I walked you through the thought process. A couple people I saw on Twitter were commenting on the rankings saying, oh, well, this guy's too high or this guy's too low. And it happened to be a lot of guys who I talked about on the pod yesterday. And when you run through it, like initially you might look at somebody, Allen Robinson, for example, and say, well, maybe he's a little too high. And then when you start to compare and then you add in a few other factors, because, hey, last year, Allen Robinson, 29 deep ball targets. Only 2 players in the league had more. Golladay, as I mentioned, and, wait for it, Odell Beckham Jr. Odell Beckham Jr. is pretty interesting. I'll talk about him in a minute, but Allen Robinson, the numbers sort of add up. And by the way, 5 deep ball touchdowns for Kenny Golladay, only 2 for Allen Robinson. So there is a little meat on the bone there. 14 deep ball catches, so pretty solid. I like the numbers for Allen Robinson, and I really don't care who's throwing him the ball, but I kind of secretly now hope that it's Nick Foles, because Nick Foles will chuck it. He will chuck it. So let's talk about OBJ. This target volume downfield isn't surprising given who he is, given how we've seen him play over the course of his career, but it might be surprising given how he performed last year. Now, of those 33 deep ball targets, he only caught 8. So that's half as many as Golladay, only had 2 touchdown receptions. The thought process that I'm having with Odell Beckham Jr., and part of why I almost keep finding myself taking him if he falls. Now, his current ADP is the number 10 wide receiver off the board. So it puts him at about close to the late 3rd round, which, if he's falling into that range, I'm going to look to take him in a lot of instances just because I think we see some positive regression here in terms of his overall efficiency in this offense. I think the offense looks better. I think Baker looks better. I think there's a lot of pluses here, and you don't have to overpay for him. So that's a good thing. Also tied with Allen Robinson, by the way, I should note Devontae Parker. A lot of people looking at him pretty favorably this year after last year and finally the breakout. But also Stephon Diggs. Now, Diggs was not heavily targeted last year, right? He didn't even have triple-digit targets, but he had 29 targets traveling over 20 yards in the air. 31.9% of his targets. That's a big time number right there. And remember, getting paired up with Josh Allen at least helps. So I think we're going to see something similar out of Diggs this year. We're going to see lower target volume because that team isn't going to throw a lot. They're not going to be one of the most pass-heavy teams. We know that. But we're going to see target volume heavy downfield for him. So what does that mean for Diggs? I think ultimately Diggs ends up being slightly overdrafted because people love the name. He's one of those, he's not a name brand guy, but people do love the name. His ADP right now, by the way, is 25 at wide receiver. Maybe it creeps up. I think that's about fair. It's close to where I have him ranked right now, but maybe he creeps up a little further. If he does, he's overdrafted. However, even drafted in this range, I think there are going to be people who are going to be frustrated with Stephon Diggs because really, when that big of a percentage of your targets come downfield like that, it does mean, really a boomer bust profile. So, those are some of the names who were on the high end of the spectrum, but you also have to look on the low end of the spectrum as well. And interestingly, a guy who I keep drafting a lot of, who did not really look good in this metric. Now, granted, he wasn't heavily targeted last year, but only 19.4% of his targets coming 20-plus yards downfield was Mecole Hardman, just 7 deep ball targets last year. But I'm hoping we see that increase a little, but still, I'm not really worried about it because he's a run after catch, like a yak guy anyway, in that offense really bodes well. But the most glaring name, the guy who sticks out like a sore thumb, who only had 1 more deep ball target than Mecole Hardman, is Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas had 8 last year. Now, he bucks the trend. He's the exception to the rule. He's one of the lone guys out there who he does not need to do damage in that, 12.5 to 15-yard ADOT range to still be a rock star for fantasy. But the worry, if there is any worry, is if there's any volume decrease, then that puts a cap on what Michael Thomas can do. He's phenomenal. We know that. But without targets heavily downfield, from a fantasy standpoint, you do cap your ceiling. Now, granted, if you're going to see 180 targets, it doesn't freaking matter. But if, let's say we cut that number by, 2 per game, which is a lot, but you cut it by 32 targets, now we're saying, is Michael Thomas the rock star number 1? No, not necessarily. Now, granted, I don't think his target volume is going to go down because they really didn't add that much to compete with him. But it's just something to think about there with Michael Thomas. Just, one of those things you just tuck away. Some of this information you can't actualize it immediately, but you do have to make note of it. Chris Godwin, another guy who wasn't super heavily targeted downfield, 17 though for him, so still a lot more than Michael Thomas. But you compare that to Mike Evans, who had 25, so 8 more, a half more per game is what he averaged. I expect that to be pretty similar with Brady under center, and those ideas are baked into my my ranking for those guys, Evans still offers, significantly more upside. Whether you love him or hate him, we can't really deny that. So wide receivers, that's something that I look at for sure. Now, one of the things I look at for running backs, actually, I'll give you two. One is breakaway runs. So these are runs of 15 plus yards, 15 or more yards, I guess I should say. And last year, super insightful because, some of the leaders in this category, Nick Chubb, 20. Derrick Henry, 18. Josh Jacobs really stands out here with 16. What's fascinating here is if you did sort of a blind taste test, right? And you said, hey, who do you think led the league in runs of 15 plus yards last season? Before I even told you what I just told you, I think a lot of people would have said Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey had 13. That was as many as Leonard Fournette, as many as Dalvin Cook, as many as Marlon Mack, as many as Aaron Jones, one fewer than Chris Carson, one fewer than Joe Mixon, one fewer than Devin Singletary, and Raheem Mostert. McCaffrey didn't get it done with the big plays as much as you might have thought, at least as a runner. So I did find that interesting. Adrian Peterson had one fewer than Christian McCaffrey. Zeke doesn't, I don't think this is a huge surprise. Zeke doesn't really pop here. He has 12 of them. So he's not, it's not a terrible number, but he's not among the leaders. Kamara, 10. One more than Alexander Madison. Now, I will say, these aren't necessarily the most sustainable over the long haul when you're talking about some of these guys like Mostert, Singletary, or even Madison. The rate is going to regress, but it still can give you some insight into who is explosive, and at the same time, guys who weren't explosive. When you look at guys who had some of the highest volume, and then you look at them in this stat, it is really interesting. Le'Veon Bell, for example, we talked about him a bunch over the last couple shows. 244 rushing attempts. He had 2 runs of 15 plus yards. That's by far the lowest. But David Montgomery, not too far off there. 242 carries, 5 runs of 15 plus. So these guys just aren't creating. They're not creating explosive plays. By the way, Devontae Freeman, 184 carries last year, only 5 runs of 15 plus. So I wouldn't hold my breath on Devontae Freeman, kind of revitalizing his fantasy value if he lands somewhere. Or I think he will. So let's say when he lands somewhere, I don't know if we're going to necessarily see that happen. So I like using the breakaway runs, but of course I also like using our elusive stats. So when it comes to elusive stats at PFF, we have 2. First is forced missed tackles, or you could also call it avoided tackles. Whatever the heck you want to call it is fine with me. I've always called it forced missed tackles, but I know that tackles avoided tackles is also out there. Then also yards after contact. So technically speaking, are you elusive if contact is made? Not necessarily as elusive as if no contact was made, sure, but you are still elusive in that you're breaking tackles and you're creating after that initial contact. So I know there are people out there who've debated what we call this. Really, we're playing semantics because we know what we're talking about. When you force a missed tackle or when you create after contact, right? So those are super important for me because running backs who can create after contact are creating extra fantasy points. Last year, the leader in forced missed tackles was Josh Jacobs. Also one of the better in yards after contact per attempt at 3.48. Nick Chubb was a rock star, so he pops in both metrics, as does Josh Jacobs. Maybe I'm a little too low on Josh Jacobs, just saying. Maybe I'm a little too low. But Nick Chubb, 66 forced missed tackles, 3.77 yards after contact per attempt. Chris Carson also pretty good in this metric as well. 62 forced missed tackles, 3.63 yards after contact per attempt. Derrick Henry was the champ in yards after contact per attempt last year at 4.18. The only player qualifying better than him was Tony Pollard, but Tony Pollard had over 200 fewer carries. So, take that for what it's worth. This, though, is also the area, if you've listened to this pod over the course of the offseason, where I will point out the deficiencies of one David Johnson. David Johnson, last year, on 130 rushing attempts, forced 6 missed tackles. That is not good. He averaged 2.05 yards after contact per attempt. There were only a few players in the league who were worse in that metric. Tariq Cohen, who is not a running back, really. He's a change of pace. He's not a between the tackles guy, so whatever. I'm not really worried about his number. And then 2 Miami running backs in Patrick Laird, who's kind of a passing down back himself. And then the immortal Kalen Ballage at 1.51. That is hard to do. But anyway, players who outgained after contact: David Johnson, Jalen Samuels, 2.21, Boston Scott, 2.28. Now, granted, they didn't have a ton of volume, but neither did Johnson really last year. Peyton Barber, 2.31. David Montgomery, 2.33. Frank Gore, 2.44. Le'Veon Bell looks like a stud compared to David Johnson in yards after contact at 2.67. Le'Veon Bell forced 41 missed tackles as a runner last year. Now, granted, he had 311 carries, but still solid numbers there in terms of yards after contact. Maybe some surprising guys in terms of yards after contact. Leonard Fournette, 3.34. Pretty solid. And I was asked, by the way, about my Fournette ranking. I did talk about this on the show yesterday. The reason for it's pretty simple. If the team is looking for an excuse to trade him, his future is a bit uncertain. So I'm a bit uncertain with Leonard Fournette. How about this? Benny Snell, 3.18. Definitely a little surprising to me. He wasn't really the most elusive guy at the college level, kind of like, more of a plotter. But when you compare him, you stack him up against James Conner. Now, I'm not going to look at the receiving numbers because Snell really didn't do a ton there. 3 catches last year, right? But he had 108 rushing attempts, 116 for Conner. Snell was at 3.18, 20 forced missed tackles. Conner, 2.75, 14 missed tackles, forced missed tackles. So the numbers paint a more favorable picture for Snell than they do for Conner, and that is definitely something that we need to consider, at least in the run game. In the passing game, Conner's the superior player. I'm not, that's not even an argument. But that is something we should pay attention to. Does Snell carve out the lead in the early downs? Because McFarland is a smaller player. I'm not quite sure how he's going to fit into the mix with that group. Obviously brings crazy speed, but it's going to be interesting. And I do not think we should be overvaluing James Conner right now. Very, very important takeaway from, when I've been doing rankings, when I've been going through all this. I know that people have in their memory the James Conner of 2018, but we cannot forget the James Conner of 2019. Right now, he's the number 24 running back off the board. I guess that's fair. I would much rather be taking some guys behind him in ADP. Like Raheem Mostert's behind him. I'm not in love with Raheem Mostert, but I would rather pass on Conner at ADP and take Mostert at ADP, if that makes sense. And sometimes you have to think that way in drafts. Not I'm going to take Mostert ahead of Conner, but I'm going to prioritize my roster so that maybe I'm taking a wideout where Conner's going, or a tight end where Conner's going because he's going in the 5th round. And then where Mostert's going in the 6th round, that's when I go back and I address running back. It's a roster construction thing that you have to be thinking about when you're drafting. Anyway, just figured I'd shed a little light on the subject today in terms of my process. We'll do some more of this as we move forward here. But coming up tomorrow, we do have the schedule release. So that's obviously pretty important. I will record the pod before the schedule release comes out. So we'll actually really dissect it on Friday's show. But talk a little bit about, schedule, strength of schedule, all that fun stuff on the show tomorrow, in addition to a few other things. All right, that's it for today. PFF.com for those rankings. Also did a post today on Dominator rating, breakout, age, and PFF grade, what I talked about on the pod on Monday. All of that is now up on the site. It's pretty cool stuff. Pretty insightful. Pretty insightful. Go check that out. Anyway, on Twitter, at Jeff Ratcliffe, and on Instagram, at Jeff Ratcliffe, hashtag RatPack. I see you, RatPack. All right, I'll catch you on the flip side for another edition of the pod. For PFF, I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and I'm out of here.